Dr. Piero Gastaldo is the doctor in laws, and he has been Segretario Generale at the Compagnia di San Paolo, and now he is the president, and this is namely why he's here for us. He is the president of the Fondazione 1563, Foundation 1563 for the Arts and Culture, which is, some of you may know that because he's one of the main actors, probably the main actor, in some specific fields of studies here in Piedmont in general, not only in Turin, in Piedmont and in Italy in general, especially working on in the artistic fields, in the history of art, in the history of architecture. For us, it's very, very important. They are the leading foundations for instance, for prosecuting the studies on Baroque, Piedmontese Baroque, which is, well, one of the favorite subjects here in Piedmont since ever. And I think this is one of the reasons why we are here in Festival della Tecnologia, in School of Engineering, in a Politecnico here in Turin. I don't know if the slides are okay. Yes. When I see PowerPoint. Yeah. Here it is. So probably first, Dr. Piero Gastaldo will present a little bit his institution, the institution he's president of, with a short introduction.
Thank you so much, Professor Pace. Thank you all for being here, and above all, thank Bella for having accepted this invitation. I hope my Turinese version of English will be acceptable to most of us. If not, please raise your hands, and I will immediately go back to Italian and ask for our kind interpreter to step in. In a way or another, the name of the Fondazione itself, Fondazione 1563, should tell a lot about our identity. As Professor Pace was rightly saying, one of our main roles is to be, so to say, custodian of the memory of this institution that was actually born in 1563. So it's one of the few cases of a charitable institution born under the Ancien regime, in fact, during the Counter-Reformation era, which has been able to survive through the centuries, to evolve, and to become, nowadays, a fully fledged foundation, like the many grant-making foundations that you would meet all over the world, in Europe or the US, or increasingly also in Asia, Africa, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously having such a rich heritage means that that the archive itself is an extremely rich mine of data that can be used in extremely different ways, depending on the interest and the outlook of those who use the archive. In a way or another, it's quite clear that the main roles that the archive has played so far have been connected to those disciplines, those families of disciplines that go under the label of historiography. And in a way or another, you can imagine that an institution that has been playing a role in charity, public health, credit, banking, public finance, and so on through the centuries will be an important source for both a social historian, for economic historians, but also for historians with more specific outlooks. Health, for instance. We were talking yesterday with Bella about the incredible amount of informations having to do with public health, which are hidden in the archives of several institutions that have long stories. I mean, we were not there at the time of the Black Death, but we were there at the times of the epidemics of peste, as it was called in those days, that hit northern Italy in the 17th century. Well, obviously, let me say, for a very long amount of time, the fundamental use of archives, like ours, was in a way or another restricted to a community of academics, researchers, who had, on the one hand, a familiarity with the basic sources, with the tools of the trade, and at the same time had to dig into these huge mines of data without, in fact, any information technology tool available. Until the 1970s, more or less, but it was very rare to find someone working in the humanities that had any interest in or any access to information technology. One of the first examples of information technology applied to, let me say, the field of humanities, and above all to an important element of the historical heritage of the European tradition, I would say, maybe surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, in any case, can be found in Italy in the immediate post-war years. I mean, 1947, 1949 is when Father Busa had the idea of using the then emerging information technology to do a linguistic analysis of the Summa Theologica, which is, as you may know, one of the great works of medieval theology. It's a huge body. I mean, there's if you have it in a printed form, it's several volumes. And he had an interest in analyzing the uses of concepts in that treatise, and had an interest in trying to find how often, for instance, certain concepts were expressed and how often they were connected with other concepts, creating logical connections, arguments, and so on and so forth. So this Jesuit father in the 1940s, when no one would have thought of that, started to hunt around for the available information technology, and ended with with what was then, say, something more than a startup, but still not a huge company, IBM. IBM was one of those companies that had developed computers during World War II for, above all, military purposes, above all, to make artillery calculations possible in a much shorter time than would have been the case beforehand. And so he started to get in touch with the then chief executive of IBM, Mr. Watson, and started developing, in fact, a way to apply computer technology, a still very young field, to the analysis of texts. That was, in a way or another, the beginning of digital humanities, as we call them now. And under this label, we put, but it's a subject that will be covered to a much greater extent and much better by Bela, those aspects of the humanities in which digital tools are reshaping the way in which we approach the classical objects of the humanities, texts, images, visual materials, and so on and so forth, with the help of information technology, and the connection between the two, the technology on the one hand, the field on the other, is reshaping the ways in which we look at the field itself, and in a way or another is redefining the way in which people working in the humanities are, in fact, defining the disciplines. In a way or another, the angle that we will try to explore in this conversation is connected to one specific aspect, to one specific academic field within the humanities, at least in my case, which is history. Obviously, there are many other aspects which are covered by the Collège des Humanités, and so Professor Capozzi will talk of them. In my case, I'm focusing on the very large, by the way, area which goes under that label, and which is typically one that has been, to a very large extent, influenced by the new emerging technologies. Our foundation has, in fact, a peculiar advantage in the sense that, on the one hand, we have the so-called the raw materials, the mines, the data, and those are embodied in the archive, an archive which covers, as we've seen, almost 500 years, which has by now 2 linear kilometers of paper materials, and which is obviously a huge source, as we were saying, of data, which, however, would be, to a large extent, difficult to access, and above all, difficult to analyze and to integrate if they were just looked at, analyzed using the traditional techniques. There's no way any historian could read all the materials and try to draw any kind of conclusion by such a huge archive. So one of the first tasks, obviously, of our foundation has been to use the available technologies in order to create the conditions for applying information technology to this huge repertoire, to this sizable heritage. And so being a foundation that has its own financial resources, which is, I must say, not usually the case with archives. Very often there are extremely interesting archives, even richer than ours, which, however, are there without any, let me say, any patron saint assisting them. In our case, St. Paul is proved to be a quite powerful one, and so has been, in a way or another, helping us throughout history to be able to combine heritage and resources. Well, in this case, obviously, having the data is one thing, having the possibility to work upon them with advanced technology is obviously another aspect, which makes our case maybe a bit unique. But obviously, we feel a great deal of solidarity for other archives who are less fortunate than we are, and so we are working also in order to create, I would say, a platform, a system of interaction among archives that will make it possible to connect the information of which are, say, condensed in a way or another, trapped within one single archive, and to make them, say, an object of analysis which can be easily and immediately connected with other sources. So in the slide, you see that the Fondazione 1563 is involved in at least 3 ways in which one may look at the interaction between digital technologies and the humanities. The first one has to do with the management of the cultural heritage in a broader sense. And I will not focus on that in the current presentation, but obviously this is quite relevant in itself, because obviously there are many ways in which information technologies, and in particular digital technologies, are reshaping, for instance, museography. And I think that some of them will be maybe touched upon also in the presentation of Professor Kaposis, and one of the themes of the Collège des Humanités has also to do with that. But you can just imagine how the combination between, for instance, augmented reality tools and the built heritage or museums can redefine the experience of the visitors in any museum. And this is quite clearly one of the fields on which there are interactions between the community working on the humanities and the technological communities. But then, and this is the second point, it's exactly on research in the humanities that we can play a role by opening up to digital technologies. And this is what I've been, in a way or another, already pointing at in my initial considerations. Finally, there's a third point where the digital dimension enters the picture very powerfully, and that is communication and, if you want, dissemination side, where the results which have been achieved by historians, by scholars in their research, are made available to the general public and in a way or another enter the public discourse. This is the dimension that is often evoked under the name of the label of public history. What does, in a way or another, public history means? Making history relevant to the public dimension now. Making history an element upon which or around which one can build, once again, a civic sense, a sense of, on the one hand, what holds us together, but also of the problems and the complexities that we are facing when we look at the past and when we look at its influence on the present, which are, as we all know, many and in some cases tragic and troublesome. So moving in this direction obviously has meant, first of all, a lot of preliminary work. If you have such a huge archive, the first thing to do will be to generate the data and the metadata that will be, in a way or another, the founding stone of any further analysis, of any further research project. And so, over the years, the very capable staff of the Fondazione 1563, together with a community of professionals, both in the academic and in the non-academic sector outside, companies, for instance, that are working on the field, we've been able to create, I would say, a very living digital archive, which is based on our documentation. So to the extent that right now, in a way or another, you can look at a good, I would say, 50% by now of our data without having to go physically to the site where the archives are kept. There is, in fact, a digital study room which is as accessible as the physical study room. And this is obviously extremely important for making in a way or another, our sources available to a much larger audience and community of scholars. But then there is also the need to connect what is available through our archive with what is available in other archives. And obviously this means, in a way or another, data mining in a cross-cutting direction, which will be able to create connections between archives. This is obviously one of the fields in which there's a lot of, say, work going on. And since I'm pretty sure that Professor Capozzi will be much better at, say, defining the overall framework and explaining what the current trends are, through the very qualified example of what the Collège des Humanités is doing in such a privileged institution as the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, I will be just focusing on one example, which is, in a way or another, quite telling about the potential of these tools when they are applied to an archive. And in order to explain what this Progetto Le Vite, the lives, actually means, I will have to go back to one of the several episodes, a very tragic one, but one of the several episodes which are documented in our archive. Now, to make a very long story short, Compagnia di San Paolo was born in 1563 as a charitable institution, which, however, also did credit. And in those days, it was mostly not-for-profit credit, something that today we would describe as microcredit, probably, or in any case, interest-free loans. Then over the time, it evolved, it created a fully-fledged bank, the one that is now known as Intesa San Paolo, fundamentally. But during the many centuries where credit and philanthropy, credit and charitable goals coexisted, say the bank had become, the entity, the Compagnia di San Paolo had become, in fact, already something quite different from its beginnings, in a way or another. In the 1930s, it was, in a way or another, generally perceived as a bank with some philanthropic aims, but fundamentally a bank. And, say, tragically, when in 1938 Italy introduced what were fundamentally anti-Semitic laws. I mean, they went under the label in those days as racial laws. We could describe them as racist laws, because, by the way, at the same time, there were other elements in the legislations which were, for instance, trying to prevent mixed marriages in the small colonial empire. So there was a very strong racist element throughout this legislation, not just anti-Semitic, but in any case, in the case of Italy in those days, the main aspect that was perceived was the anti-Semitic one. And one of the elements of this legislation was that the real estate owned so the houses owned by Jewish families were to be fundamentally taken away from them and administered by entities set up for the purpose. So in the case of Piedmont and Liguria, the Italian Northwest, the entity that was chosen for administering the confiscated properties was the Istituto San Paolo of those days, that is to say, an entity which was halfway, as we were saying, between different institutional settings, but still an entity that obviously had its own administrative structures and so on and so forth. Other similar entities were chosen in the other Italian regions. For instance, in Lombardy, it was Cariplo, and so on and so forth. This is a very dark side, obviously, a very dark page in the history of the institutions, but we didn't want to conceal it, to hide it. On the contrary, we wanted to explore it entirely in order to set the record straight and to understand how this could have happened and what the implications and the impact was. So, in a way or another, after a first season of research, so to say, in which all the documents were analyzed, we discovered that there was a huge wealth of data that was very much about individual lives through this apparently impersonal data that were, say, having to do with this piece of, say, this building here, this apartment there, this farm in another place, and so on and so forth. You were, in fact, telling deeply important stories about individuals, about families, about human beings. And we were in a position to be able to connect what was documented in our archives with what was documented in other archives. And we could, in a way or another, recreate the lives, hence the reason for the title of the project, and able to understand how history, in a broad sense, European history with all its tragic aspects in those days, crossed individual lives, reshaped them, and in many cases destroyed them. So the idea was to look not only at the victims, but to all the surrounding communities. For instance, the employees of the bank that were, in a way or another, accomplices of all these evil deeds, and at the same time were apparently, like in many other cases, justifying themselves because they were following the rules. But there were many other protagonists in such stories, the surrounding communities, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the idea was to try to go in depth and analyze the lives of these people in order to understand better the overall historical process that was taking place around them. Now, there is a very recent book, which is an interesting example of how discussions are still taking place in the historical community, in the community of historians, Storia senza perdono by Walter Barberis, who happens, by the way, to be a member of our board, apart from being a friend and a professor here at the University of Torino, which is very much focused on the dialectics between memory and history. So the title of today's meeting was using memory as a key concept. Now, obviously, a memory is essentially individual, subjective, no? So if you look, for instance, at today's meeting, there will be the official record. If anyone is recording what we're saying, that will be the basic information, the data. Each of you will have a different recollection, probably a very fleeting one, in the sense that in a couple of days everything will be forgotten, but don't worry, that's not the point. The point is that if we were to ask you, when you are leaving the hall, about the memory of your personal recollection, each of you will probably be giving a slightly different version. And each of you will probably be focusing on some aspects and not on others. And the same holds true for the memories of the people that have been involved in such tragedies, in all this tragic history. There have been many cases, by the way, in which individual memories have been totally reshaped over time by what the people have in the meantime read or heard. I recently read an interesting article by, say, Oliver Sacks, the well-known neuroscientist, among other things, that was about his personal experience. He was telling his brother, you remember the day when our school, primary school, was bombed in England, and I was almost there, you see, and he said, no, you didn't, you weren't there, you were in the countryside, and I was there. I told you so often about the event that you were convinced that it was about you, but in fact, you never have been there. And in fact, all the available documents show that his brother was right. And Sachs had not been trying to forge a false memory. He was absolutely convinced that things had happened. Now, the same things happen very often when you go for the collection of individual memories. So oral history, which is an important dimension today of historiography, has to be, in a way or another, combined, and in some cases corrected, by documents. And so the voice of the documents needs to be heard. And in order to have documents speak, so to say, you need to work on them, to transform them into something else. So the first thing we needed to do was to listen to the voice of the documents, so turning the data into something that would tell us more. There is a concept, time machine, which will I would say, be covered much better by Professor Capozzi. But the idea is that we are now in a condition, in a situation, with the help of digital technologies, under which we can have a look simultaneously at what was happening on, for instance, one specific day throughout Europe by simply looking at sources which are all digitally available. We can connect archives among themselves so as to know exactly, or almost exactly, all the events that are connected with some moment in time and which may interact among themselves. Something totally unthinkable before the digital revolution. So we are able, in a way or another, to create time machines that will be able to give us a perception of what it was, how it was in a given moment in time. And obviously, in order to do that, we have to work a lot on the digital analysis of data. But in order to turn all this into public history, we needed to have a much larger community involved in the project. And so overall, there have been more 35 institutions which have been cooperating with us on the project. And increasingly, in a way, in a snowball effect, families and communities providing voluntarily, so to say, their own data, their own collections, their own memories, and helping to create larger, I would say, set of data, as well as a larger community of analysts. Some of them were, in fact, the students that were involved in the project in several schools. I'm happy to see some of them around here today. And they gave a fantastic contribution because, in a way or another, by working, they discovered new sources, they discovered new ways to connect available sources, and so they were able to help create narratives which were at the same time historically grounded in a very serious way, in a very impeccable way, I should say, and at the same time would be capable of involving audiences which are otherwise not necessarily reached by historical analysis. So this dimension has been undoubtedly another one in which the use of integrated technologies, audiovisual, digital, and so on, has been extremely fruitful. It's unlikely we would have been able to achieve the same results without this new technology. And the same is true, obviously. This is why the evolved, say, advanced tools of analysis are extremely important. So obviously, we start with geolocalization, but also, say, chronologies in the metadata and LOD are extremely important elements of any analysis. So, once again, the final result, for instance, of such a project is one that will never be able to be fully condensed in a book. So while the work of a former generation of scholars, I mean, typically had as its result the book, and the bigger the better, so to say, or the article. And once again, if it's on a journal, say, with obviously an appropriate editorial policy, it will be very relevant for your academic career. All that is good, but at the same time, we want to explore other uses of history and other ways to look at history, which are not just linked to the academic dimension. And in order to be able to reach other audiences, to reach wider audiences, undoubtedly you need different tools. So this is why we have been increasingly relying on, I would say, highly complex technologies that, in a way or another, have totally reshaped the nature of the product. So while applied humanities typically in the past produced printed materials, now we have these results which can be used in a multiplicity way, including, by the way, obviously printed sources or online sources in a written form. But at the same time, there is such an important essential element in the integration of images and, for instance, recorded materials, sounds, music, and so on together with the written data, that you are definitely creating a different kind of tool. I think it's very interesting, since most of you come probably from the engineering side of the Politecnico. It's extremely important to have young researchers, young professionals such as you, entering in a dialogue with the humanities, with history, with the arts, with literature, and so on and so forth. Because this can really reshape both the ways in which humanities are practiced, produced, but can also inspire probably tools, say paths of research, lines of analysis in your technological exploration. So I think that this marriage between memory, history, data, and technology is an extremely promising one, and one of which I hope, I mean, a larger community of scholars will be involved over time. We can just try to be of help, but the task is mostly in your hands. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. And I think it's very important that we have this kind of discussion at the Politecnico, and not only at the University of Turin or the University of Lausanne. And you've given me a difficult task, because every time you said, but he will give you much more information on that. And I'll give you different information. Okay, so I have two positions currently, and I'll try and use those to make sense or to comment on the topic of our panel. My first is, as it was said, I'm a historian, early modern Europe. That I do at the University of Lausanne. But the last 2 years I was mostly dean at the EPFL at the Collège des Humanités, as was also said. So I also this year I decided to teach again at the university, and I have lots to do with students at the EPFL, and of course the interests are very different. And one part of my mission of the Collège des Humanités is to find ways where students can interact, to establish research projects where students from engineering and sciences, so from the STEM background, interact and work out new questions and try to find new solutions with students coming from the university. That's not always easy, but it's very useful as an exercise because it makes you question what you do as a historian. And it's not always easy for students. By the way, show of hands, are there any historians in the room or not? Okay, 3, 4, that's good. Welcome. So you see, it's not always easy, certainly for students at a Politecnico in Lausanne, to try and give them a sense of often very different questions that are asked by historians, art historians, psychologists, sociologists, and so on. And on the other side, this bridge is clearly present to tell students in the humanities and history and so on that what is done at EPFL. And ironically, we have 2 master programs in digital humanities, one at the Politecnico and one at the university. And we try to get them to work together. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's not. But you see more and more people your age who have a dual qualification, who are musicians, who are professional musicians or professional historians, and then they do a second degree, either in computing, and then it gets really interesting. So partly, I think what we're talking about is also to ways in which, and that'll be the topic also then of the follow-up panel that starts in 45 minutes, of how through teaching you can bridge the gap between the 2 communities. But since there are very few historians here, I would like just to say a few words what we actually do as historians. Because we've spoken about memory, we've spoken about heritage, about archive, historians, and so on. And to give you a sense of where interaction is possible and where it is not yet very clear to me. Perhaps to others they have a clearer position. So as a historian, what I do, first of all, I interpret facts from the past. It could be social phenomena, political, cultural, you name it. Everything that's in the past, that's my terrain. So you see already there, that's very big. And historians, we don't have our own vocabulary as some other disciplines do. We take our vocabulary from all the other disciplines and we're interested of how they develop or understand events that really that no longer exist. Political systems, economic systems that existed at a certain moment and then vanished. Okay, so what we do as a first step, if you're interested in understanding and interpreting past phenomena, you have to have, since we are Politecnico, call it data, right? And if you don't have data, you can't do it. So in one sense, you can say the more, the better. Digitalize absolutely everything, and then we have lots of data. But that doesn't really get you to history yet. Because if you have millions and millions of pages that are scanned, that are made available, let's stick with the example of the fantastic archive, really, of the Fondazione. If you don't know what you're looking for, you can go from one page to the next, and you can spend several lives doing that. So part of the historian, and that is a big debate, is of how much an idea you have to have of what it is you are looking for. You come with questions. That question that might be a hypothesis, that that is something I'm interested in. I'm interested in that person, in that relationship, economic boom, or anything else. If you don't have that, then you can have as many zillion of data packages as you wish, and it doesn't make much sense. You can arrange them. So I think part of what is involved to make a digital history process work is, in a second step, or perhaps even in the first step, you have to have a sense of how this data could be used. Now, and then once you have the data, you have to collect it, and you have to verify that the data is exact. You have to know where it comes from. That is metadata. In an archive, it gives you not only a document, but it tells you how it is classified. That's very important. That's how archivists, they structure their archive. And that also is important. And then we come to the next step, is to interpretation. And that gets much more difficult. You have historians who say, if we do digital history, we will end up with only a very particular kind of history. And they fear that we will go back to the 80s, where there was a boom in structuralist history, social history, and economic history, where the individual really didn't matter. Smaller institutions really didn't matter. And what you do, you look at big trends, right? That is one way of explaining history. You look for patterns. And that is something, obviously, that would be closer to people in computing and so on, where you find sequences of historical facts. And if you have these sequences, some people would say, well, that's enough. Those are the real big movements. We don't want to know about the little man, the little woman. And there are historians who say that if we do digital history, we'll end up in a place that they think they have left 30 years ago, and it will be only a particular kind of history. So one of the problems we have to address is when we talk about making available at large scale historical data through archives, does that impact the way we write history? Will that exclude certain forms of history? They will say, those who are more skeptical, they say, hang on a second. History is not just simply causality and sequences and patterns that can be traced through comparison of data, but it's about understanding. And if you want understanding, so one is explanation, one is understanding, that is a typical difference you find in historiography, the science of doing history, is if you're interested in understanding, you're much more interested in motivation, for example, of a person. Why does that person do this and this? Why they decide to go to war? Why do they decide to introduce financial system and so on? So, and there, of course, the critics of digital history would say that you can't get out of a digital archive at all. So better not open up the screen. Let's just go to the archive and do things as we did before. And I'm halfway sympathetic to that position, except that even if you follow a line, if you have a position as a historian to say, I'm really interested in understanding rather than sequencing patterns of events, you also depend on all your understanding of motivations, of intentions, emotions, of a wide cultural context that explains, gives meaning to a particular historical document or a historical phenomenon. You have to gather data, you have to compare it. So there's no easy way out. I think in any case, as historians, we profit from the availability of digital data, as long as we know where the data comes from, that it incorporates all that it follows international standards, that incorporates all the metadata that the archivists over centuries have perfected. That is very important. And then the question will be, for me, or which I try to follow, is there a new kind of history that can be written, even for those who are much more interested in understanding rather than explaining? So I won't give you concrete answers because I don't have any, but I try to develop the questions that are coming to us as professors of history. And we try, obviously, also to find ways to introduce that into our teaching. Perhaps that is then one point we can come back to. I would like to conclude briefly with a remark on one of the last slides, that is public history. And I think there the archive, indeed, an archive like the Fondazione, has an important role to play. One shouldn't underestimate the enormous interest people have for their own story. Don't forget, an archive, we talked about memory can be subjective. In some sense, memories are always subjective, but the role of the archive, and I speak as a non-archivist, so I'm appropriating a bit that role, is to check, right? You think you were last Wednesday, you were in Milano, except you were here, you have amnesia, and there's some sort of archive, some of that tells you. Same about an event from the 18th century, 19th century. So archives in that sense, they should be as they are archives nowadays, they are highly professional, they should give you some sort of bedrock you can go back to and check. At least you have a different version. Whether that's always entirely true, that's a different thing. That's the fate of human institutions and human documents. But to come back to the enormous interest I witness in, say, a general educated public for either their own personal history, the history of their neighborhood, the history of the religious group they are affiliated with or they belong to, of their city, of political movements and so on, is enormous. And archives, they can play, particularly digital archives, can play a very useful role. My experience with archives is I was asked to, just as an episode, to curate a private archive by a scholar, and I didn't find a single archive, in the end I did, who was willing to take them, including the 14,000 books of an excellent collection. They said, we don't have space, it doesn't fit into the overall profile of the archive, and this is something that comes more regularly. You have people who have data, sometimes it's just holiday snaps from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Now, we have historians who find that extremely interesting, but only if you can combine it with 500 other people who took holiday snaps in the same location or in different locations. And you can start analyzing them by various tools, recognition tools, for example. So a digital archive can become more open and more participatory. It is less closed away, so the main function of the archive of preserving document can become slightly differently. And my experience is that the general interest for archives, thus understood, increases tremendously. I think the success of these sorts of transformation that we're witnessing depends on whether you can combine archives then also with research that requires, as we've seen, reaching out to universities, but not only the University of Turin with the history department, but I think also to the Politecnico. And that is important to get research groups involved. And of course, then also to find ways to advertise what you have, as you did here, and to give examples of how other people can do it, even if they're not necessarily professional historians. I think I'll end it here, and then so we have time for some discussion. Thank you.
Just thank you, Piero Gastaldo, and thank you, Bella Caposi, for such an interesting and challenging presentation, where they probably explain much better than I could do why we are here today, here at the Politecnico. Because this is when a couple of people, plus me, raised their hands, who is historian. So the others may wonder why talking about history, about archives, about memories, and in which terms we could talk about these topics at a Politecnico. A couple of considerations. The school from where Professor Caposi comes, the École Polytechnique de Lausanne, and the other Polytechnic school in Zurich, as well as, for instance, the MIT, that is probably the three great terms of comparison for the Politecnico di Torino, the three super big Polytechnic school. Since a very, very good deal of time, they have courses in the history in general. In Zurich, Francesco De Santis, the greatest Italian historian of literature, has taught in the 19th century. In Lausanne, for instance, for my studies, the most recent and interesting studies in Pierluigi Nervi's oeuvre has been done in the history of architecture. In MIT, well, everybody knows the role played by MIT with history. So history, humanities in general, but history is a subject for the Politecnico, and this is for sure. For those who can't measure the dimension, because it is important to measure dimensions, they told you, they gave us some clues, but probably one data can be of some importance. The state archives in Turin, which is not the greatest state archives at all, but it includes the archives of the family of Savoy and the archives of the king, well, the duchy and then the kingdom of Savoy until the Italian unification, has something like 80, not 18, 80 kilometers of documents. If you put in a sequence the documents that are kept in Via Santa Chiara or in Piazza Castello, you get 80 kilometers, which is half the way of Piedmont. It's important. It's what Piero Gastaldo said. Nobody could have time for reading them all. And so the first consequence, and this was important, the first consequence, digitalization or computer-aided research on documents is fundamental. It's fundamental. The work on St. Thomas Summa Theologica was absolutely groundbreaking for us all, because, and probably the name of Umberto Eco is quite familiar to you all, and Umberto Eco literally played with linguistics at an enormous extent and computers at the same time. So quantities are essential. Just to frame the problem, it's not just something concerning few dusty historians having to do with a couple of families or a couple of architects or a couple of engineers. It's something concerning us all. Concerning, and this is the other important term, concerning the preservation of history, the construction of history, which is something extremely different from memory. They both told us this. It is important to trace the difference between. They're both important. They're both important. Either collective or individual memories are fundamental, but they are not history. They are not history. And here comes my first question. Well, for some reasons, you both have answered already in part to that. But compared to the old historians, old-fashioned, non-digital historians, before it means not to cheat it, it means until 30 years ago, until 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when first experiences were made. Well, is there any substantial difference in methodological reasons? I mean, the work we do with sources, has it changed completely since the digitalization or the offering of digital sources? And what kind of digital sources historians must handle? Because what you were saying at last was dramatically important, because digital sources produced by archives, by the Fondazione, by the state archives, digital sources produced no matter how well, this is a problem probably. It happened with paper, it happened with other kind of, it happened with visual products. It happened probably, but our attitude probably may change. How did it change our work, our daily work?
So yesterday we were asking us the same questions, and Bella gave a much more interesting answer. So,
okay, back to me. Yeah. How does it change? I think it changes in part, but it doesn't change entirely. So I could stop here. But what I mean to say is, as a historian, you can simply continue. If you're not into computing, you don't have to open it. You can continue doing your history. That's fine. You can go to archives, but I also lived as a researcher. If you occasionally go to archives, I'm sure not yours. You have 3 books per day you can order, and then sometimes 2 books are the wrong ones. Happens regularly, not here of course, that all 3 of the books are not the ones you ordered, and then you had it, and then you go to a cafe for the end of the day. So I think there are clearly some very important improvements through the availability of data. If you don't have it, well, then you don't have it. But having it have the electronic data still requires all the historical tools of a trained historian. Historians, for you, right? We are the data analysts of the past, of the pre-digital age. But I think as we are data analysts, historians more and more also have to be aware of the use and the potential of digital tools. A lot of historians, when they leave their university, they don't work as historians directly. Some go into teaching, but you find them absolutely everywhere where there's need for lots of data to be sifted through, to be organized, to be rendered compatible. Historians generally are fairly good at doing that. We're trained to do it. And I think that in historical training, there will have to come an integration of digital tool training. You have a basic understanding what the algorithm does, and how it can be used, how it can be altered, or at least you don't have to be a computer wizard. You should be able to talk to a computer specialist. Even the ability to communicate often is not there, I think, from both sides. So we have to work on that. In that sense, I think the work as a historian has to take into account or on board the critical use of newly available digital data. That is part, because that's what we do, data search, right? But I think the methodology will remain largely wedded to a historical training. I think occasionally you come across, as a last word briefly, you come across digital projects where suddenly you have these networks and you have hundreds of names and you have a big blob in the middle. And it's satisfying for 10 seconds. And then you say, so what can you do? So what? Someone spent 2 years doing that. And luckily, we moved away from that. And I think for all good projects like the Venice Time Machine, you have data made available, but without them telling you that's the kind of history you have to do. You still have to do that work. So again, historians will, I defend my profession, but I think we have to take on board the new digital data and be able really to communicate with you here. Thank you.
Well, I obviously share with, by the way, the real historian, and just one who tries to help historians do their own job. But I must say, in the end, what you were referring to implicitly can be summed up in a couple of keywords. One is searchability, obviously. So the searchability of these data mines has increased exponentially. In order to find the connection between, for instance, names in an archive, you had to work for weeks and weeks on volumes or documents and so on and so forth. If data and metadata have been generated in a proper way, now you can do it in a matter of minutes if you're asking the right question. So searchability and accessibility are the two elements which have been radically changed in a way or another for most of us by the digital revolution. And obviously the point is that once you have searchability and accessibility, you still need intelligence, rationality, understanding, the Verstehen, and the way in which the historian has typically been trained is still extremely relevant for defining the ways in which you use the data. It is true, in a way or another, like in many other fields. I mean, you can then from there go forward, and there are some extremely interesting technological applications based on machine learning, even some aspects of artificial intelligence which are increasingly entering the picture. So one may imagine that in the near future you will have, say, historians that instead of having the research assistants underpaid and in some cases undermotivated and so on and so forth, will be able to employ a virtual research assistant that will be able to access on their behalf and to work on their behalf on huge amounts of data, provided the right questions have been asked. And that undoubtedly is still the key point. So asking the right questions and then drawing interesting consequences. Otherwise, we will simply end up with this, say, quite bulimic approach to data, which is not necessarily actually useful, or in a way, say, which is not necessarily expanding our historical knowledge and understanding of things. But there are excellent reasons for believing that the digital tools are extremely important and will increasingly be important. Just an example, for instance, of what artificial intelligence and machine learning may do, in fact. As you know, all the old documents in an archive have been written with the different kinds of writing that were typically used during different ages. I mean, if you look at a 16th century document, in many cases, not to mention a medieval document and so on, you will have some problems if you're just not trained in paleography. I mean, well, now you have machines that have been trained to read those writings and translate them into contemporary, I would say, forms of writing, which obviously make it extremely easy to understand also what was once, I mean, a time-consuming task in itself. In some cases, they are even quicker than a well-trained paleographer. I mean, but the same may hold true for musical notation, by the way. Also in that case, you have different ways of. So, I mean, that is obviously, like in many other cases, technology helping us to get rid of the most menial tasks. No, we don't have to carry the volumes from the underground, say, to the... but obviously the most interesting side of it, analysis, understanding, asking questions, trying to find answers, well, that's typically still the historian task.
Okay. Is there anyone who wants to make a question? Or we still have 15 minutes, so oops. Because otherwise I can, if there's no one, probably I can underline some other aspects of their presentation. And what is, I think, they told us, probably the crucial aspect in this subject, which is what is concerning what they called public history, what is called public history. Public history is much more than a practice in the history because it has an incredible public value, of course, because making public history also means to involve more and more people in making the public value of what we were, what we have been, what we can be, what we have read, what we will be educated to be, etc. This is fundamental. And in my opinion, it is fundamental that schools, Polytechnic or university academies or whatever, schools do educate students and teachers, because actually we are not educated to that because we were born before. But to educate us all in public history, especially, I think, but I need your opinion, especially on two terms. First, who is selecting the data? Not who is mining the data. Who is selecting the data that will go on the digital archives? This is important because before, you had them all. If you had time for the 80 kilometers, that's okay, if you had time, if you had more than 3 lives. But now you all have them on the computer, on your computer at home, just because someone before decided that these were the documents you may need, or you may read, or you can, or you are allowed to read. And this is quite different. On the other side, we don't have more historians, of course, because history is a discipline, history is a profession, so we don't have more academics in history. But we have more people who can debate about history and who can try to falsify what the historian says. To say, I say something discerned by documents, you may say that I was wrong. While extending this audience, probably the falsification principle gets more and more complicated, or not.
I was going to start with the methodological question.
Okay, that's the Lockean idea. If you have free churches, then the good ones will triumph, or reason will come out. I'm not so sure about that. That the more people, look at the social media, it's not because we have 4 or 5 billion people who suddenly talk that we have a public sphere where the reasonable things will come to the top. But as to your question about who decides of what data should go into a digital archive, how many servers can you buy? Who pays your electricity bill? So there are lots of things which is, on one hand, you can be idealistic that everything should be a total time machine. I'm not sure I would be very interested in that. In some sense, you already have these the big American companies. They have digital or they have data archives that surpasses anything that was ever seen even in the biggest. So they just suck everything up, and then if they can make use of it, then they will. But if we're talking here about a digital archive that could be linked to the one of the Fondazione, then I think that is the archivist who has to decide. I mean, I can't see how else you want to do it. Has to decide that's where we want to invest money in. That's where we see a real interest or a need from a public point of view. And I think it will be package-wise. But on the one, I think this is a development where we're still pretty much at the beginning. And at some point, the pure, simply economic or technical aspects might be that we have to limit it. I really don't know. I mean, some people say it's just not going to happen because there will be absolute cost explosion in electricity, in server capacity, and so on, needed for this movement to go on. But interesting with the more public history approach is that it's partly the archivist, but I think also he can also react to what is coming in and to the interests either by deposits and so on. So I think it becomes a much more livable or alive archive. And that is interesting, how if you can fix it, say that's what we do and no centimeter more. That'll be difficult. Those will be policy decisions.
There's a question. Yeah.
No, anche l'italiano. Ma lui capisce l'italiano, quindi non ha neanche bisogno.
Continueranno gli altri.
Noi abbiamo riflettuto in realtà sulla digitalizzazione di archivi che oggi sono cartacei e quindi di digitalizzare tutto e quale tipo e quante informazioni e quali informazioni rendere disponibili. Mi sembra che questa sia stata la tua domanda. Quello che mi dà da pensare, e non so se è proprio una domanda o una riflessione, è oggi che invece i documenti vengono fatti in maniera digitale fin da subito, con quali modi, con quali criteri, con quali processi verranno archiviati e dunque costituiranno poi un patrimonio al quale noi potremo accedere come oggi accediamo alle fonti primarie o secondarie che ci sono negli archivi. Perché se il documento cartaceo proviene comunque da una situazione che è già molto codificata all'interno di uffici, che parlo anche per esempio di amministrazioni pubbliche che hanno già dei codici molto precisi. Oggi, e lo vedo per esempio anche nel mondo della scuola, dove esistono 10 tipi di registri elettronici, quindi non esiste più un modello unico per tutte le scuole dello Stato, ma sono differenti. La mia riflessione è, tra 50 anni, lo storico che si deve avvicinare a questa mole di dati che è oggettivamente più complessa e più volatile, che tipo di competenze deve avere? Perché diventa ancora più difficile l'interpretazione del dato. Questa. In inglese non ce l'avrei fatta così.
Possiamo, anche perché ci dicono che dobbiamo molto rapidamente, è un problema così serio che è stato chiesto da parte del sistema Compagnia di San Paolo alla Fondazione 1563 di dare le risposte, di fare una sperimentazione esattamente sulla selezione dei dati generati già in ambienti digitali. E questo, sono due temi diversi quelli che tu posti. Uno è il tema della selezione, e lì ci sono, come si diceva già anche da parte appunto di Bella Capozzi, due scuole diverse, se vuoi. L'idea della conservazione a oltranza e l'idea della, come dicono i francesi, cassation dei documenti, no? E quindi ovviamente questo vuol dire a un certo punto scegliere i documenti in maniera attiva. Cioè, ecco, io credo che per le ragioni che si diceva, ragioni pragmatiche, non puoi pensare di avere un ipercloud con dentro assolutamente tutto, compresa i dati secondari della mia busta paga di 19 anni fa, eccetera, eccetera. Vabbè, a questo punto, per ragioni pragmatiche, la selezione dovrà avvenire. È importante che l'idea stessa di selezione venga orientata da persone competenti, come sono indubitabilmente gli archivisti stessi. Il secondo tema è quello dei supporti, cioè l'obsolescenza dei supporti e l'esigenza di creare quindi forme agili di passaggio da un supporto all'altro, e su questo di nuovo anche c'è un grosso lavoro da fare, anche perché molti non sono particolarmente sensibili a questo tema. Secondo me la quantità di dati che sono già andati persi e basta è enorme. Se io guardo anche a dati visuali, eccetera, che sono stati prodotti. C'era a un certo punto un progetto qualche anno fa di avere una giornata di internet documentata, no? E naturalmente però una giornata di internet vuol dire già una quantità di dati assolutamente spaventosa, e comunque sarebbe stata una giornata, no? Ecco, quindi da questo punto di vista io credo che alla fine, almeno al momento attuale, prima di essere in grado di creare, non so, grandi serbatoi di dati su Giove, cose di questo tipo, non abbiamo una risposta, se non anche lì quella della selezione, che mi sembra inevitabile.
Yes.
My name is Pietro Ger. I'm working on a private company, and we have started to look at the problem of personal data which are produced in a very excessive way, to the point that memory starts to disappear. It's no longer a big problem for historians, because our memories, the data is so much that our memory is gone. And this is a problem of our identity, and it will be also a problem for historians in the future. However, I wanted to make this point. Excessive production of data and storage has an impact on the environment. 2 points. Electricity, there is a limit. It's already well known that this production of data, the storage, are placed in the Arctic, but they are melting the Arctic. So we need to stop producing excessive data. On a personal basis, in the public administration, in the universities, and so on. I'm not in favor, particularly, to the digitalization of everything, and there are already emerging concerns about the real usefulness of big data in many areas. So I think we will tend to converge in a direction of more a moderate approach, balancing the advantages of both approaches.
Do you want me to answer? Well, just to come back to your question, I think that's a very serious concern. I have as well. I still like that what I publish comes out in paper. That's pretty good. It remains a couple of 100 years, and we don't know how long things stay in the cloud. So print it out if you think that the documents you have will be important for future generations, and store them somewhere. Someone.
Use all paper.
Yeah. Regarding more moderate use, I hope that in public administrations they'll find a way to be more moderate. I'm skeptical about it. I wouldn't say that big data isn't useful. I mean, it would be difficult to say that is useful. That is for what? You know, I think of course, you can do lots of stuff with it. As a researcher, it's very useful to have it. But if it gets us to the promised land, that's a different question. Okay, I think we have to.
Yeah, we have to go